Think about everything you would lose if every computer at your work stopped booting tonight, and then ask where the copy is. On the 15th of August, 2012, that happened to one of the largest companies on Earth, and it happened on purpose. Around 30,000 workstations at Saudi Aramco were wiped in a matter of hours. Not encrypted, not stolen from, erased. Nobody asked for money. There was no ransom note because ransom was not the point. The point was that the machines should stop existing. And the company that pumped something like 1/10 of the world's oil ran itself on typewriters and fax machines for weeks afterwards, not as a stunt, because there was no other way left to write a contract. This is the episode where destroying things became a normal instrument, and by the end you will know the exact design decision that stopped it being far worse. Start with the date, because the date was chosen, and it tells you a great deal about who did this. The 15th of August 2012 fell during Ramadan. More specifically, it was around Lailat al Qadr, the Night of Power, one of the holiest nights in the Islamic calendar. Anyone still at a desk that day was there because something had gone wrong with their holiday, not because the office was open. In Saudi Arabia, that means the offices are close to empty. Most staff were on leave. The people who would normally notice something wrong were at home with their families. Whoever set the timer knew that. This was not a piece of malware that happened to go off. It waited for a moment when the fewest possible people were watching. Somebody had studied the calendar of the organization they were attacking, which is a very different kind of work from writing the program. At around 11:30 in the morning, local time, it started. What an employee would have seen if anyone had been sitting there is a machine behaving normally and then simply not being a machine anymore. The program did two things in order. It overwrote the files on the disk. Then it overwrote the small piece of the drive that tells a computer how to start itself. Both steps ran on a timer on every infected machine aimed at the same moment. That second step is the one that matters. Wiping files is bad. Destroying the ability to boot means the machine cannot even be used to fix itself. It is the difference between emptying a filing cabinet and welding the office door shut with the cabinet inside. And it did not do this to one machine. It had already spread across the corporate network, and it went off across all of them at roughly the same moment. It had been sitting on those machines quietly for some time beforehand, which is the part that is genuinely frightening. The number that gets reported consistently is around 30,000 workstations. Some accounts say 35. Aramco has never published a precise figure, and I am not going to pretend one exists. Either way, hold the scale for a second. 30,000 computers. That is a small city's worth of desks, and every one of them dead in the same afternoon. There was one more thing, and it is the detail that turned an incident into a message. Where files had been, the program left an image, a burning American flag. You do not do that for money. You do not do that to hide. Leaving a picture is the opposite of a burglary. It is a statement, and it was meant to be found. It also tells you something useful about the attackers. They were prepared to give up their access in exchange for being noticed. So before we go further, I want you to understand what kind of company had just been switched off. Saudi Aramco is not a large company in the way that a large company you have heard of is large. It is the state oil company of Saudi Arabia, and at the time it was producing on the order of 9 to 10 million barrels a day. Roughly 1 barrel in every 10 consumed on the planet came out of this one organization. When it later listed a fraction of itself on the stock market, it was, briefly, the most valuable company in the world by some distance. It employed tens of thousands of people, ran its own townships, its own airline fleet, its own schools and hospitals. Which means the corporate network that just died was not an office email system. It was the nervous system of something closer to a small state. Purchase orders, shipping schedules, contracts, payroll, drilling records going back decades, human resources files, supplier payments, engineering drawings, well logs. The seismic data that tells you where to drill next, which took decades and enormous sums to gather. And here is the thing people underestimate about a wiper. So I want to be concrete. The problem is not that the work stops. The problem is that the record of what you were in the middle of stops. You do not know which supplier you owe. You do not know which tanker was told to sail where. You do not know what you agreed on Tuesday, because Tuesday was in the machine. A company at that scale is, in a real sense, made of its records. Take the records away, and what is left is a very large number of people who do not know what they are supposed to be doing. Aramco's own account, given publicly afterwards, is that the objective was to stop the flow of oil to domestic and international markets. That is a state-level objective. That is not a criminal one, and it is the reason this episode belongs in a series about wars rather than about crime. It also failed at that objective, and the reason it failed is the best part of this story. So what did they actually do on the morning of the 16th? The first decision was the biggest, and it was made fast. They pulled the plug, physically. Aramco disconnected its entire network from the outside world. Data centers offline, remote access cut, the company severed from the internet. No phased response, no wait and see, no meeting to decide. Somebody with the authority to do it said, cut everything, and everything was cut. That is an enormous thing to do to an organization of that size, and it was the right call, because you cannot reason with something that is already inside and still spreading. Teams went office to office, building to building, machine by machine, unplugging network cables by hand. I want you to picture the physicality of that, because we talk about cyber attacks as if they happen in an abstract place. This one was answered by people walking down corridors, pulling wires out of walls. There is no software solution at 11 at night. There are people with torches in server rooms. Then the second problem arrived, and it was the harder one. 30,000 machines needed to be rebuilt, and a rebuilt machine needs a working hard drive. Aramco did not have 30,000 spare hard drives. Nobody has 30,000 spare hard drives. So they went out and bought them. Reporting at the time described teams flying to factories in Southeast Asia with instructions to buy every drive available, paying above market and taking priority in the production queue. Drives were flown in. Aramco was for a few weeks effectively bidding against the entire consumer electronics industry for a component. The number usually given is around 50,000 drives. And this is my favorite detail in the whole story because of what it says about scale. A single company buying replacements for one night's damage was enough to bend the global price of hard drives for months. Other people's laptops got more expensive because of an attack most of them never heard about. Meanwhile, the company still had to function. And this is where it stops being an IT story and becomes something stranger. They went back to paper. Typewriters were brought out, faxes, interoffice mail, contracts and shipping paperwork done by hand. Deals were reportedly conducted by phone and by fax with counterparties who had to be persuaded that this was, genuinely, how Saudi Aramco was doing business that week. Suppliers who had spent years being asked to use the online portal were suddenly being sent handwritten paperwork by a company worth hundreds of billions. And the payment systems were down, which produced the single most surreal consequence of the attack. For a period, Aramco could not process payments for fuel inside Saudi Arabia, so it gave it away. Tanker trucks kept running to the stations and the petrol went out for free, because free was easier than broken. Getting the basics of the business network working again took somewhere on the order of a week to 10 days. Getting everything genuinely restored took about 5 months. 5 months. For one night. Now let me tell you what this program actually was, at the level that is worth understanding. Researchers named it Shamoon, after a word found inside it. Some vendors call the destructive component Disttrack. It is the same family. It had 3 parts, and the design tells you what it was for. A part that spread it to other machines on the same internal network. A part that reported back, and a part whose entire job was to destroy. Notice what is missing from that list. There is no part for stealing anything. There is no part for staying hidden long term. There is no part for asking for money. Every piece of malware you have heard of before this has a business model. Espionage wants to read your files and stay quiet. Crime wants your money and needs you alive to pay. Even sabotage of the Stuxnet kind had a target and a purpose beyond the damage. This did not. A wiper has no business model. It has an objective. And the objective is that afterwards, the thing should not work. That is a genuinely new category in 2012, and it is the reason security people still talk about this attack 14 years later. There is one design point worth knowing, and I will keep it at the level of why, rather than how. Writing directly to a disk underneath the operating system is normally something an ordinary program cannot do. Windows will not let it. So the attackers did not break that protection. They brought a legitimate, commercially sold, properly signed piece of software whose entire purpose is low-level disk access and used it as the tool. It is legitimate software, it is sold commercially, it has entirely ordinary uses, which is exactly why it was trusted. Read that again, because it is the whole lesson. They did not defeat the lock. They arrived carrying a key that a company sells, and the system checked the key, found it valid, and opened the door. This is now such a common technique that it has a name in the industry, and defending against it is genuinely hard because the thing being abused is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. The defense is not to block the tool. The defense is to notice that it has arrived somewhere it has no business being. There is a second uncomfortable point, and Aramco has been fairly open about it. For this to reach 30,000 machines, it had to start somewhere inside. The reporting and the company's own statements point to access obtained through someone with legitimate credentials on the network. The exact route in has never been fully published, and I am not going to fill that gap with a guess. Not a firewall that failed, not a clever exploit of the perimeter, a door that was supposed to be open, being used by someone it was not supposed to open for, which is the same shape as almost every serious incident in this series, and it will be the same shape in the next one. So who did it? On the day of the attack, a group calling itself the Cutting Sword of Justice posted a statement on a public text sharing site. They claimed responsibility. They gave a political justification, framing it as a response to Saudi policy in the region. The statement was written in the register of a manifesto, and it named the company and the grievance in the first paragraph. And they did something that made researchers take the claim seriously. They posted a list of internal network addresses, and they announced a time. The time they announced matches when the wiping started. That is hard to fake after the fact, and it was published before the incident became public. So the claim is real in the sense that whoever posted it had genuine inside knowledge. What the claim is not is proof of who they were. Anonymous groups take credit for things they did not do constantly, which is why the network addresses mattered so much. A name posted on the internet by an anonymous group is a costume. It tells you what they wanted to be seen as. It does not tell you who they were. And here I need to be careful, and I want to explain why rather than just being careful at you. Shamoon has been widely attributed to Iran. That attribution has been made by United States officials speaking publicly and privately, and by a number of security research firms. It has never been tested in a court. Nobody has been charged. There is no indictment to read, no evidence in the public record that a defense lawyer has ever been allowed to argue against. Compare that with other episodes in this series where there are indictments naming individuals with dates and evidence. Here there are none. So the honest sentence is, this is attributed to Iran by governments and by researchers, and it is alleged. Not proven. Alleged. I labor this because the difference between attributed and proven is the difference between journalism and rumor, and this series is on the journalism side of it. What I can tell you is the context that made people reach that conclusion, and you can weigh it yourself. In the 2 years before this, Iran's own nuclear program had been the target of Stuxnet, the first widely known case of code being used to break physical machinery. That was a joint operation, never formally acknowledged, that physically damaged centrifuges at Natanz. And Iranian oil facilities had themselves suffered a data wiping incident a few months earlier, in April 2012. So the argument runs, a country that had just been on the receiving end of both a physical sabotage campaign and a wiper attack turns up months later with a wiper attack of its own, aimed at its regional rival's oil company. Timing, capability, and motive, all pointing the same way, is how intelligence assessments are built, and it is genuinely how you would reason about it. That is a motive and a pattern. It is not evidence, and it is worth being precise about the difference. I want to come back to the recovery because there is something in it that is genuinely useful to you, and it usually gets skipped. Aramco got back on its feet in a way that most organizations of that size could not have, and it was not because of clever software. It was because a very large company still had people who knew how to do the job without the system. Somebody knew which suppliers mattered, somebody had a phone number written down, somebody remembered what the staining arrangement with a shipping agent was because they had negotiated it. That is institutional memory living in human beings rather than in a database. And in August 2012, it was the only copy that had not been overwritten. You cannot buy that. You cannot install it. It takes 20 years to accumulate and one restructuring to lose. I think there is a real question in that for anyone running anything today, and it is not a comfortable one. If the system went away this afternoon, how much of what your organization knows would go with it, and how much of it is in somebody's head or in a drawer? Not the passwords, the knowledge. Who does what, who to ask, how the thing actually works when the process document is wrong. 2012 had an advantage we no longer have, which is that the people who remember doing it on paper were still in the building. The second thing that saved them was slower and less romantic backups that were not reachable from the network that was attacked. Not clever backups, just copies that lived somewhere the wiper had no path to. This is the single most important practical sentence in this episode. A backup that is permanently connected to the thing it is backing up is not a backup. It is a second copy waiting in the same queue. A wiper does not care that a drive is called backup. If it can write to it, it will. Which is why the professional standard is that at least one copy is offline, or on media that cannot be rewritten, or in an account the ordinary network has no path to. The technical term you will hear is an air gap, or immutable storage, and the principle underneath both is the same one. If you take one operational thing out of the next half hour, take that one. Go and check whether your backup is plugged in right now. The third thing is the one nobody enjoys. Aramco was rebuilding 30,000 machines from scratch, and that means they had to know what was supposed to be on them. Which machines existed, which department they belonged to, what software each one needed to do its job. Most organizations discover during an incident that they do not have an accurate list of their own computers. It is the least glamorous document in security, and it is the one that decides how fast you come back. Now here is the part of the story that I think is the most important, and it is the part that almost never gets told. It is the reason this is a Cyber Wars episode rather than a disaster story. Because for all of that, 30,000 machines, 5 months, a company running on fax paper, something did not happen. The oil kept coming out of the ground. Not one barrel of production was lost, and that was not luck. A company like Aramco has two completely different worlds of computing inside it, and understanding the difference explains most of what you will read about industrial cybersecurity for the rest of your life. The first world is the one you recognize: laptops, email, spreadsheets, shared drives. In the industry, it is called IT, information technology. The second world is the machinery, the systems that open a valve, run a pump, hold a pressure, control a refinery. That is called OT, operational technology. Some of them are decades old, run software nobody supports, and cannot simply be patched on a Tuesday afternoon because stopping them means stopping the plant. They look like computers, and they are not the same thing at all. An OT system's job is to keep a physical process inside safe limits continuously for years. And at Aramco, in 2012, those two worlds were separated, genuinely separated. Different networks with controlled and limited crossing points between them. Not a firewall rule that somebody could disable. A genuine architectural split decided long before anyone at Aramco had heard the word Shamoon. So when the wiper tore through the business network, it hit 30,000 desks, and it did not reach a single valve. The people in the control rooms watched the office side of the company die and kept the plant running, because their systems were on the other side of a boundary that somebody had built years earlier for exactly this reason. I want to give proper credit for that, because it is the most underreported fact of the entire incident. Some engineer at some point in some meeting argued for keeping those networks apart. It would have been inconvenient. it would have cost money. Somebody almost certainly complained that it made their job harder. And nobody in that meeting knew they were preventing anything, because you never do. And that decision is the reason this was an extremely expensive administrative disaster instead of an interruption to a tenth of the world's oil supply. Nobody got a headline for that. The successful version of security is always invisible because it consists of a thing that did not happen. It is worth saying that the separation is much harder to maintain now than it was then. Modern plants want remote monitoring, predictive maintenance, live data flowing to head office. Every one of those is a real business benefit, and every one of them is a new path between the two worlds. So the boundary that saved Aramco in 2012 is, at a lot of industrial sites, thinner today than it was 14 years ago. That is not nostalgia. That is the actual trend, and the people who work on it will tell you so. 2 weeks after Aramco, it happened again somewhere else. On the 27th of August 2012, Rosgas in Qatar, one of the largest liquefied natural gas producers in the world, was hit by malware in the same pattern. Its office network and website went down. As at Aramco, gas production itself continued, the pattern held, the office side collapsed, the industrial side kept running, and again, the separation is why. 2 of the largest hydrocarbon producers on Earth in the same region inside a fortnight. At that point, this stopped being an incident and started being a campaign. And Washington noticed publicly in a way that had not happened before. In October 2012, the United States Secretary of Defense gave a speech in New York about cyber threats. He described the Aramco attack directly. Attacks on private companies abroad were not normally something a defense secretary discussed by name. He called it probably the most destructive attack the private sector had seen to date. A serving defense secretary naming a specific attack on a specific foreign company from a podium. That same speech is the one where he warned about the possibility of what he called a cyber Pearl Harbor. That phrase has been mocked a great deal since, and some of the mockery is fair because the thing it described has not happened in the form he meant. But read what he was actually pointing at, and it is more specific than the headline. He was saying that the capability to destroy rather than to spy now existed and had been demonstrated. And on that, he was simply right. That is exactly what August 2012 demonstrated. There is a strategic point underneath this that I think is the real reason the episode matters. Espionage is stable. Everybody does it. Everybody expects it. And getting caught reading someone's mail does not usually start anything. Destruction is not stable. Destruction demands a response, and the responder gets to decide what counts as proportionate. Espionage can be absorbed in silence. Damage cannot, because somebody has to explain it. So the moment a state allegedly wipes a rival's national oil company, a question opens that nobody has a good answer to. What is that? Is it an act of war? Is it vandalism? Is it something in between that has no name? 14 years later, there is still no agreed answer, and every wiper attack since has been fired into that same gap. No treaty covers it cleanly, and no country has been willing to define the threshold in advance, because defining it also constrains you. Which brings us to what Shamoon actually started. It came back. Twice. That we know of clearly. In November 2016, and again in January 2017, a second wave hit Saudi government ministries and companies. Researchers called it Shamoon 2. Same family, updated, and again timed for a holiday weekend when the buildings were empty. The people behind it had learned nothing new about mercy and everything about timing. And they changed the picture. Instead of the burning flag, the machines were left displaying a photograph of a drowned Syrian child taken on a beach the year before, an image the whole world had already seen. I am not going to say more about that than it deserves, but I will say what it means, because it is the point. Using that photograph is a claim about who the victims are. It is propaganda, aimed at the people cleaning up the mess, and it tells you the destruction was always the message rather than the method. In December 2018, a third variant appeared, hitting an Italian oil services contractor with operations in the Middle East. And the category itself went everywhere. What was novel and shocking in 2012 became, within a few years, an ordinary tool. Wipers dressed up as ransomware. Wipers used as cover to destroy the evidence of a break-in. Wipers used in the opening hours of actual wars, the most destructive incident in commercial history. 4 years later was a wiper wearing a ransom note as a disguise. When a state wanted to make an organization stop existing after 2012, this was the shape of the thing it reached for. And the reason is that Shamoon worked. 30,000 machines, 5 months of recovery, no arrests, no indictment, no consequence that has ever been made public. If you are designing incentives, that is not a deterrent. That is an advertisement. So let me put the whole thing back together quickly, because the shape is what you want to keep. Someone got in through legitimate access. They used a legitimate signed tool to do the damage. They waited for a religious holiday. They destroyed rather than stole, and they left a picture so you would know it was deliberate. What went wrong was almost entirely about the office. What went right was almost entirely about a boundary somebody insisted on years before and about copies that could not be reached. 2 failures of process on one side, 2 acts of foresight on the other. The foresight won by a wide margin. Nothing in that sentence is about a clever product. All of it is about decisions made calmly in advance by people who were not under attack at the time. That is genuinely the whole discipline. Security is a set of inconvenient choices made on an ordinary Tuesday, cashed in on a night you did not pick. Nobody is at their best on the night. That is precisely why the decisions cannot be made on the night. And the cost of the ones Aramco had already made is measurable in the negative. 1/10 of the world's oil did not stop. The cost of the ones nobody had made is measurable too. 5 months, 50,000 hard drives, and a company the size of a small country typing contracts on a typewriter. And that second number was a choice too, made by not making it earlier. One more thing, and then the takeaways. iBlock. Aramco talked about this afterwards, publicly in some detail, at conferences. They did not have to. Almost everything useful in this episode exists because a victim chose to explain what happened to them, and that is rarer than it should be. 4 things you can do something about. None of them needs a budget. 1. Go and look at your backup, physically, today. If it is plugged in, and the machine it protects can write to it, it will die with that machine. 1 copy needs to be somewhere that a program running on your computer cannot reach. That is the difference between a backup and a second victim. 2. Know what you would do with no systems at all for a week. Not a plan in a folder. A real answer. Who do you phone, on what number, using what to keep the actual work going? Aramco got through that week on people, paper and phone numbers, and the ones that had those written down were the ones who could help. 3. Find out what crosses the boundary between your office systems and anything physical. If your work touches machinery, a building system, a vehicle, a till, a lock, ask what path exists between that and the network your email lives on. Aramco survived because that answer was short. Most organizations have never asked the question. 4. Stop thinking of attackers as people who want something from you. Ransomware trained everyone to assume there is a negotiation. Shamoon is the reminder that some attackers have no interest in you continuing to exist, and none of your assumptions about how this ends apply to them. Which is a heavy note, so here is the honest counterweight. The thing that beat Shamoon was boring, cheap, and available to everyone. Separation, copies, and people who knew their job. Next Saturday, Cyber Wars goes to the place where the boundary did not hold. Ukraine, December 2015, and again in 2016, the first blackouts anywhere in the world that were officially attributed to a cyber attack, operators watching their own screens as somebody else moved the mouse. I am Niels. Thanks for the half hour, and go and check that back up.